What if the most dangerous force shaping our world wasn't born in a garden, a heaven, or a holy book, but in a forgotten understanding buried beneath African soil? What if what we call evil today is just imbalance, renamed, repackaged, and exported across centuries? And what if the people who understood this first were written out of the story on purpose? Tonight, the veil lifts on an ancient African legacy, older than the Bible, older than empires, a spiritual intelligence that tracked collapse long before it happened. Not through prophecy, but through observation. Not through fear, but through balance. This isn't about gods and demons as you've been taught to imagine them. It's about a hidden system that still echoes in faith, politics, and identity today. Because once you see how this knowledge was distorted, minimized, and redistributed under new names, history starts to feel less accidental. Patterns repeat, power behaves predictably. And suddenly, the modern world looks like a familiar chapter in a very old cycle. So listen carefully, not as a believer, not as a skeptic, but as someone standing so as willing to remember. And before we go deeper into this ancestral revelation, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments, from which part of the world are you listening to this forgotten memory? Long before ink touched parchment or prophets spoke in borrowed tongues, there was already a whisper moving through the African night. It traveled with the wind across savannas older than memory, carried by drums carved from sacred trees. The elders said history didn't begin with books. It began with breath, with stories spoken so carefully they could reshape reality itself. Funny thing is, not everyone's comfortable admitting that. Some truths tend to make people shift in their seats. They spoke of a force that wasn't born in gardens or fallen from heavens, but emerged when order first cracked. Not a horned monster, not a villain with a name, just a principle that thrived on imbalance. Archaeologists today might call it early cosmology, while ancient voices would simply say the world went out of rhythm. And yeah, that explanation never really made it into Sunday sermons. As the story goes, the land itself reacted. Rivers changed course, animals behaved strangely, and dreams grew heavier. Communities didn't panic, they listened. They understood that when harmony breaks, it echoes everywhere, in the soil, in the blood, in the spirit. This wasn't fear-based religion. It was observation, refined over thousands of seasons. Rituals emerged, not to worship that force, but to contain it. Fires were lit at precise hours, chants followed patterns aligned with stars that modern science would only later map. There's an irony here. What some now label primitive superstition required a level of astronomical and ecological knowledge that universities still struggle to fully explain. Guess progress depends on who's telling the story. And as night settled over those early civilizations, a quiet question lingered in the smoke of the fires. If imbalance could be recognized, could it also be named, reshaped, or hidden? That question didn't fade. It waited, patiently, for new languages, new symbols, and new interpretations to carry it forward. As generations passed, memory became the true archive. Long before stone temples or carved tablets, the African landscape itself held the record. Hills remembered footsteps, rivers remembered oaths. The elders taught that geography wasn't random, it was chosen. Every settlement rose where earth and sky seemed to agree, where silence felt intentional. Funny how modern maps miss that part entirely. Within these lands, people began to notice patterns repeating across time. Droughts followed moral collapse, abundance followed balance. It wasn't superstition. It was correlation observed over centuries. Today, scholars might cautiously call it environmental ethics. But back then, it was simply understood as consequence. Not everything needs a footnote to be real. As communities grew, so did their awareness that something unseen moved beneath daily life. It wasn't evil in the theatrical sense, no lightning bolts, no apocalyptic drama. It was subtle. A slow drift away from harmony, showing up in leadership, trade, and even how people spoke to one another. That quiet drift, they believed, was far more dangerous than open chaos. To track it, priestly lineages formed, not kings, not tyrants, but watchers. They memorized cycles of stars, animal migrations, and human behavior. When imbalance appeared in one realm, they looked for it everywhere else. There's a strange irony here. The more holistic their worldview was, the less it survived contact with later, more advanced systems. By the time the first outsiders arrived at Africa's edges, they mistook this deep awareness for mysticism and this caution for fear. They never realized they were walking into a civilization that had already mapped the mechanics of collapse. And somewhere in that misunderstanding, the next distortion quietly took root, waiting for its moment to surface. In the beginning, no one tried to name the force. Names give shape, and shape invites control, or so the elders believed. Instead, they spoke around it, using metaphors drawn from nature: a shadow that lengthens at dusk, a drum beaten out of rhythm, a river that forgets its source. The absence of a name wasn't ignorance, it was restraint. Some things once named refused to stay still. Over time, however, silence proved risky. Without language, the imbalance slipped through cracks in ritual and memory. Younger generations felt its presence, but lacked the words to recognize it. And that's usually how trouble starts, not with ignorance, but with half-knowledge, pretending to be enough. The elders noticed, and concern crept into their chants. So symbols emerged. Not idols, not faces, patterns. Spirals carved into stone, intersecting lines painted with ash and blood, rhythms beaten only during specific moons. These symbols didn't describe the force. They tracked it. Think of them less as stories and more as instruments, ancient diagnostics for the unseen. Modern minds might call it abstract thinking. Ancient ones called it survival. The force responded, not with anger, but with adaptation. Where people learned to watch it, it grew quieter, subtler. It learned to hide behind ambition, behind certainty, behind the seductive comfort of believing one already knows enough. There's a sharp irony here. The more confident a society became, the less it noticed what was unraveling beneath its feet. And as those symbols spread from village to village, carried by traders and initiates, they began to shift slightly, just enough to be misunderstood. A pattern here, a rhythm there, altered, simplified, reinterpreted. That slow distortion would one day cross deserts and seas, ready to be reborn under entirely new names. When the symbols reached the Nile, they found stone instead of sand, temples instead of circles of fire. Egypt didn't invent these ideas. It refined them. Balance became law, order became divine, and chaos was finally given a formal place in the cosmic story. Not a villain, not a rebel, just the ever-present threat of things falling apart. Clean, elegant, and much easier to export. Priests spoke of order as something fragile, constantly under pressure. If rituals failed, if leaders lied, if justice bent too far, chaos didn't need to attack, it simply returned. That idea feels uncomfortably modern, doesn't it? Almost as if corruption wasn't a moral failure, but a spiritual malfunction. Strange how that framing never made it into political theory textbooks. Hieroglyphs captured what oral memory once carried: scales, feathers, serpents, fractured crowns, visual shortcuts for forces too complex to explain aloud. These weren't myths for entertainment. They were manuals. And yet, centuries later, we admire the art and ignore the instructions. There's a quiet irony in museums full of warnings no one reads. As empires rose, order became centralized. Balance was no longer everyone's responsibility. It belonged to kings, laws, and gods with official names. Chaos didn't disappear, it adapted. It slipped into bureaucracy, into hierarchy, into the belief that power itself could replace harmony. That belief, history shows, has a terrible shelf life. And when foreign scribes arrived, eager to translate, simplify, and reorganize, they mistook function for fiction. The African understanding of imbalance was trimmed, moralized, and prepared for long journeys beyond the continent. What returned later would sound familiar, but feel very different. As those ideas traveled beyond Africa, they crossed deserts where memory thinned and meanings shifted. In Mesopotamia, the force took on personalities, spirits, judges, tempters, easier to narrate, easier to fear. What had once been a condition of imbalance slowly hardened into characters with motives. It's more comforting, after all, to blame a figure than to question a system. Clay tablets recorded floods, divine punishments, cosmic battles. But tucked between the lines was something older, the same anxiety about order collapsing from within. Kings were warned not just to obey gods, but to rule correctly, because injustice itself was believed to awaken destructive forces. Funny how power loves prophecy, right up until the prophecy points back at it. As stories migrated again, they grew sharper edges. The subtle African idea of containment became a moral struggle. Balance versus rebellion, obedience versus fall. The narrative was getting simpler and louder. Complexity, it seems, doesn't travel well, especially when it threatens emerging hierarchies. When these ideas later echoed in biblical texts, the transformation was almost complete. The force was no longer a principle. It had a role, an adversary, an accuser, still familiar, still ancient, but reframed to fit a new spiritual architecture. Ironically, the older version had been far less terrifying and far more demanding of human responsibility. And somewhere in that transition, a quiet swap occurred. Imbalance stopped being something societies created together and became something imposed from outside. That shift would change how guilt, control, and salvation were understood for centuries. But the story wasn't done moving yet, not even close. Far across the oceans, in lands history insists were isolated, similar warnings surfaced. Among ancient American civilizations, chaos wasn't a monster to be slain, but a cycle to be managed. Time itself was seen as unstable, always threatening to reset if balance slipped too far. No devils, no eternal villains, just responsibility, an idea that rarely survives empire. Calendars were carved with precision that still confuses modern science. They tracked not only seasons, but human behavior, war, excess, neglect, all marked as accelerators of collapse. Funny how these cultures, supposedly disconnected, shared the same fear Africa had whispered about millennia earlier. Coincidence is a convenient word, isn't it? Rituals there echoed familiar patterns: fasting, symbolic death, offerings not meant to please gods, but to realign reality. Blood, breath, silence, tools rather than sacrifices. Later observers would call it brutality, missing the point entirely. It was maintenance, not worship. And maintenance, as always, goes unnoticed until it's ignored. These civilizations believed the world could end quietly, not with fire, but with neglect. No dramatic punishment, just systems failing one by one, leadership rotting, memory thinning. Sound familiar? The past has a way of sounding like commentary if you listen long enough. As explorers arrived and narratives collided, these shared concepts were dismissed as primitive myth. No one asked why the same warnings appeared everywhere. It was easier to conquer land than to confront the uncomfortable possibility that ancient people understood collapse better than we do. And that denial would have consequences, still unfolding today. Back in Africa, the response was never submission. It was vigilance. Rituals evolved not as spectacles, but as technologies of awareness. Movements were precise, words carefully weighted, silences respected as much as sound. To outsiders, it looked like ceremony. To those inside, it was calibration. You don't pray a system into balance, you tune it. Fire played a central role, not as destruction, but as boundary. Certain flames were lit only to mark thresholds between harmony and drift. Ash was read like a language, patterns interpreted by hands trained since childhood. There's an irony modern minds miss. These practices were empirical. They observed cause and effect long before the word science existed. Music, too, wasn't entertainment. Drums mimicked heartbeats, rhythms matched planetary cycles. When the beat faltered, elders listened closely. They believed imbalance announced itself through sound first. Maybe that's why silence was considered dangerous. It hid too much. Funny how noise today does the same thing. These rituals weren't open to everyone. Knowledge had weight, and weight required preparation. Initiation meant loss of ego, of certainty, of identity. You didn't gain power, you lost illusions. That detail tends to vanish when later cultures retell the story. Power sells better than humility. And as these practices continued, generation after generation, they held something back. A final layer, shared only when the world itself felt unstable. That hidden threshold would matter later, when balance was no longer merely threatened, but systematically dismantled. The dismantling didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in quietly, wrapped in trade, treaties, and unfamiliar prayers. Foreign tongues spoke of salvation, while unlearning began beneath the surface. Symbols were redefined, rituals labeled dangerous, and what once held communities steady was slowly reframed as something to fear. Ironically, imbalance didn't need to force its way in. It was invited. Sacred sites were renamed, then repurposed. Stones that once marked celestial alignments became foundations for new authority. The old rhythms didn't stop overnight. They were interrupted. Drums silenced, chants shortened, initiations outlawed. What survived did so in fragments, hidden inside songs, gestures, and memory, passed in whispers. Colonization wasn't only about land, it targeted perception. By controlling how people understood the unseen, it reshaped how they understood themselves. Balance was replaced with obedience, and complexity traded for certainty. Funny how systems that claim absolute truth rarely tolerate nuance. Yet the force the elders warned about didn't disappear. It adapted again. It moved into structures, economies built on extraction, hierarchies justified by doctrine, power defended as destiny. What had once been monitored through ritual was now embedded in institutions, invisible, efficient, and remarkably familiar. And beneath all of that, something endured, not fully intact, not loudly proclaimed, but alive. A pulse, waiting for recognition. The question wasn't whether the knowledge survived. It was whether the world was ready to hear what it had been trying to say all along. Even scattered, the memory traveled. Across oceans, through chains and forced crossings, fragments of the old understanding moved with bodies that were never meant to survive the journey. Songs carried codes, rhythms hid maps, gestures remembered what language was forbidden to say. Funny thing, you can burn temples, but you can't quite erase muscle memory. In new lands, the knowledge adapted again. Deities lost names, rituals lost forms, but principles stayed intact. Balance over domination, community over isolation, spirit threaded through daily life. To outside eyes, it looked improvised, chaotic even. In truth, it was compression, ancient systems folded tightly enough to survive pressure. Irony shows up here too. The very cultures that were dismissed as broken or lost became living archives. While official history praised progress and enlightenment, these communities quietly preserved warnings about excess, greed, and spiritual amnesia. The ones labeled backward were, in many ways, looking further ahead. You can still hear it today if you know where to listen. In music that stirs something unnamed. In movements that feel older than ideology. In the discomfort certain truths provoke when they surface uninvited. That reaction isn't random. It's recognition brushing against denial. And as this living memory continued to evolve, another shift began. What was once hidden for protection started to surface through unexpected allies, scholars, excavations, forgotten manuscripts. The past wasn't done speaking, it was just choosing new voices. As tools changed, so did the messengers. Archaeologists brushed sand from stones that shouldn't have been there. Linguists noticed patterns repeating across languages separated by oceans. Astronomers paused when ancient alignments matched calculations modern instruments had just confirmed. Funny how evidence becomes controversial the moment it refuses to stay in its assigned timeline. Tablets, carvings, and oral fragments began to line up. Not perfectly, but enough to raise uncomfortable questions. Why did distant cultures share the same warnings? Why did symbols of balance and collapse recur with such precision? Official narratives offered cautious answers, careful not to wander too far from what was already approved. Curiosity, after all, has limits when funding is involved. Still, the discoveries kept coming. Not dramatic revelations, but accumulations. A motif here, a ritual description there. Together, they suggested that ancient Africans weren't just participants in early civilization, they were architects of a worldview that spread quietly, then got rebranded elsewhere. History didn't deny this outright, it simply minimized it. What emerged wasn't proof of a single lost empire ruling the world, but something subtler and more unsettling. A shared spiritual technology for recognizing when societies drift towards self-destruction. That idea doesn't flatter modern power structures. It implies that collapse isn't fate, it's feedback ignored. And as more fragments surfaced, the old question returned with new urgency. If the ancestors understood these cycles so well, why are we repeating them? The answer seemed close now, hovering just beyond the edge of what most people are taught to accept. As those fragments surfaced, another pattern became harder to ignore. The knowledge wasn't forgotten by everyone. Some groups never lost it. They simply stopped calling it sacred. It moved into strategy, governance, economics. Balance became stability, ritual became procedure. Control replaced harmony, and suddenly the old force wore a suit instead of a symbol. Power learned to speak the language of order while feeding on imbalance. Systems were designed to look efficient while quietly rewarding excess. The elders once warned that chaos thrives best when it's invisible, when people believe nothing is wrong. There's a sharp irony here. The more organized a society appears, the easier it is to hide what's broken underneath. Ancient containment rituals had required humility. Modern structures require compliance. One asks you to listen, the other tells you not to question. That shift changed everything. What was once everyone's responsibility became centralized, abstract, untouchable. And when imbalance appeared, no one knew where to point, except at each other. You can feel it today in the tension of daily life, the constant sense that something's off, even when systems claim to be working. That unease isn't new. It's the same signal the ancestors trained themselves to recognize. Only now it's drowned out by noise, speed, and distraction. And just as the elders predicted, when awareness fades, imbalance doesn't roar. It governs quietly. But there's a limit to how long silence can hold. Somewhere beneath the surface, the old knowledge is stirring again, preparing for its next emergence. That stirring doesn't arrive as revelation. It arrives as discomfort. People start questioning narratives that once felt solid. Faith systems feel thinner, political promises sound hollow, and identity itself begins to fracture. The elders would have recognized this immediately. They taught that when imbalance grows, certainty collapses first. Confusion isn't failure, it's a symptom. Across the African continent and its diaspora, old symbols resurface in new forms, not as relics, but as reminders. Geometric patterns appear in art and protest, ancestral names return in whispers, then in pride. It's not nostalgia, it's recall, memory pushing back against erasure. There's irony in how this revival is labeled. Some call it radical, others dismiss it as trend or rebellion. That's convenient. It avoids facing the deeper truth. These ideas were never gone. They were waiting for conditions that made listening possible again. Silence breaks when pressure gets too high. Spirituality shifts too. Less fear, more responsibility. Less salvation from above, more alignment within. That's uncomfortable for systems built on obedience. Ancient African wisdom doesn't ask for followers. It asks for awareness. And awareness is notoriously hard to control. As these currents grow stronger, one thing becomes clear. The story isn't looping by accident. Cycles repeat until they're understood, and the ancestors, it seems, left just enough breadcrumbs for those willing to notice what comes next. The breadcrumbs don't shout. They appear in quiet places, in recovered languages, in rituals reconstructed from fragments, in scientific papers that hesitate before drawing bold conclusions. The ancestors never promised clarity, only direction. Understanding was meant to be earned slowly, through attention, not belief. That's a lesson modern culture isn't exactly trained for. What resurfaces now isn't a call to abandon the present, but to reinterpret it. Ancient African knowledge never rejected progress. It warned against progress without balance. Tools were celebrated as long as they served harmony rather than appetite. Funny how that distinction keeps getting lost, especially when speed becomes a virtue. You see it in how power reacts to remembrance. Harmless when symbolic, threatening when practical. Drums are fine on stages, less so in organizing. Symbols are acceptable as decoration, not as instruction. That pattern isn't new. It's the same response imbalance has always triggered when it senses exposure. Yet the revival continues, often outside institutions, in community spaces, in art, in scholarship that refuses simplification. The past isn't being romanticized, it's being interrogated. And the answers coming back aren't comfortable, but they are consistent. Collapse isn't inevitable, it's cultivated. And that realization sets the stage for the final warning the elders preserved, the one shared only when cycles reach their most dangerous point. A warning not about gods or demons, but about choice. About what happens next when memory finally meets the present face to face. That warning was never carved in stone, it was entrusted to timing. The elders believed some knowledge, revealed too early, becomes weaponized. Revealed too late, it becomes regret. So they embedded it in stories about harvests failing, leaders losing their way, skies growing strangely quiet. Signals disguised as myth, waiting for the right ears. At its core, the warning was simple, almost disappointingly so. Imbalance feeds on denial, not hatred, not ignorance. Denial. When societies refuse to see themselves honestly, the drift accelerates. The ancestors didn't fear collapse as punishment, they feared it as consequence. No thunderbolts, just mathematics of behavior playing out over time. They taught that every generation is tested, not judged. Tested on whether it recognizes the signs in time, rising inequality, sacred roles turned transactional, speed replacing reflection. Those weren't modern problems, they were ancient alarms. Funny how history keeps ringing and we keep hitting snooze. What made this warning dangerous wasn't mysticism, but agency. It placed responsibility squarely on human hands. No savior arriving late in the story. No external enemy to defeat. Just a mirror held steady, asking whether balance still mattered enough to be defended. And now, as those signs grow harder to ignore, the old question returns one last time, heavier than before. If the ancestors mapped the mechanics of collapse, did they also leave a path back? Or was the final lesson simply whether we'd listen when it mattered most? The path back was never hidden, just unglamorous. No grand return to a golden age, no ritual that could be outsourced, no symbol that worked without understanding. The elders described it as realignment, small, deliberate corrections made before collapse hardens into identity. Not dramatic enough for legends, but powerful enough to change direction. They taught that balance begins where attention returns, how resources are taken, how leaders are chosen, how the unseen is respected without being exploited. In their worldview, spirituality wasn't separate from politics or economy. It was the framework holding them accountable. Strip that away, and systems might grow faster, but they grow blind. What unsettles many today is how familiar this sounds. Sustainable systems, ethical leadership, collective responsibility. We treat these as modern inventions, forgetting their ancient safeguards. Funny how the future keeps borrowing from a past it refuses to credit. The ancestors warned that remembering alone wouldn't be enough. Knowledge without practice becomes decoration. Symbols without discipline turn into brands. That's where cycles usually fail, not from lack of truth, but from lack of courage to live it consistently. And so the final tension remains unresolved. The knowledge has resurfaced. The signs are visible. The question is no longer whether the past speaks, but whether the present is willing to answer. Because once awareness returns, imbalance loses its favorite hiding place, ignorance. By the final cycles, the elders said the most dangerous moment wasn't collapse, it was normalization. When imbalance becomes routine, it stops alarming. People adapt. They learn to live with noise, with fracture, with systems that quietly drain meaning from life. And that's when correction feels radical, even threatening. Ancient stories warned that at this stage, truth wouldn't arrive as comfort. It would feel disruptive, even disrespectful. It would challenge identities built on partial memory. That's why messengers were often rejected first, not because they lied, but because they reminded people of choices already made and paths quietly abandoned. There's a subtle irony here. Societies celebrate innovation while resisting recalibration. They chase new tools to solve problems caused by old imbalances. The ancestors would have shaken their heads at that, not in judgment, but in recognition. They'd seen this phase before, many times, yet they also believed this moment carried unusual power. When awareness returns late in the cycle, even small shifts matter more. A single decision multiplied can bend trajectories that once seemed fixed. Balance, they taught, doesn't require perfection, only sincerity, and so the story pauses here, not with answers, but with pressure. The kind that precedes either collapse or correction. Which way it turns has never been written in advance. That part, the elders insisted, belongs to whoever is listening now. What listening looks like now is quieter than people expect. It's not a mass awakening or a single revelation, but a shift in perception. Old assumptions start to feel heavy. Narratives once repeated without thought begin to crack under their own repetition. The ancestors said this is how balance announces a possible return, not with spectacle, but with doubt. In this phase, power becomes nervous. Systems sense scrutiny before they understand it. That's when rules multiply, language tightens, and irony turns sharp. Funny how calls for order get louder exactly when order is least practiced. The elders warned about this reflex. When imbalance feels exposed, it hides behind urgency. Spiritually, something changes too. People stop asking what to believe and start asking how to live. That shift unsettles traditions built on instruction rather than experience. African ancestral wisdom always leaned toward practice over proclamation. You didn't declare alignment. You demonstrated it daily, quietly, without applause. This is also when symbols regain weight, not as fashion or rebellion, but as anchors. They remind communities that identity isn't something granted by systems. It's something sustained through memory and action. That idea has survived far longer than any empire ever has. And as this tension grows, the story edges closer to its most delicate point. Because when awareness spreads without guidance, it can either restore balance or be redirected into another cycle of distortion. The ancestors knew that too. That's why what comes next was always the most carefully guarded part of the telling. What came next was never meant for crowds. The elders believed guidance loses strength when it becomes performance. So the final layer of knowledge moved through relationships. Teacher to student, elder to listener, moment to moment. It was adaptive, not fixed. That made it harder to erase and harder to control. This guidance focused on discernment. Not everything ancient was sacred, and not everything new was corrupt. Balance required knowing the difference. The ancestors warned that nostalgia could become just another trap, a comforting story that avoids responsibility. Memory was a tool, not a refuge. They taught that every era creates its own version of imbalance. Copying old solutions without understanding context was just another form of denial. That's a detail people tend to ignore. It's easier to repeat rituals than to rebuild awareness. But repetition without meaning, they said, is how wisdom turns into theater. Here's the uncomfortable part. Correction begins locally. Not in myths, not in governments, not in distant prophecies. In how communities treat land, time, labor, and each other. The elders would have smiled at how radical that sounds today, and then reminded everyone it's actually the least dramatic option available. And with that, the knowledge didn't end. It thinned out, waiting to see what would be done with it, because the final test was never about remembering the story. It was about whether anyone would recognize themselves inside it. By this stage, the ancestors believed the story belonged less to the past and more to whoever carried it forward. They said history doesn't repeat, it waits. It watches how each generation responds when old patterns resurface under new names. Empires change costumes, imbalance keeps its habits. They noticed that when societies reach this point, they start outsourcing responsibility. Blame shifts to enemies, to fate, to abstract forces no one can touch. It's comforting, really. Much easier than admitting participation. The elders had a word for this phase, not evil, not ignorance, avoidance. And avoidance, they warned, is imbalance's favorite shelter. What made their insight unsettling is how measurable it was. Resource extraction without renewal, leadership without accountability, spiritual language stripped of practice. These weren't metaphors, they were indicators. You could track them like seasons. Collapse, in their view, wasn't mysterious. It was predictable, which made ignoring it a choice, not an accident. Still, they never spoke in absolutes. Balance could return at any point, even late in the cycle. Not through grand reforms, but through consistent corrections. Less spectacle, more restraint. Less certainty, more listening. That's not exactly the kind of wisdom that trends well, which may explain why it keeps getting sidelined. And as the story edges toward its final threshold, one tension remains unresolved. If the knowledge has survived this long, across distortion and denial, what exactly is it waiting for now? The answer, the elders hinted, depends entirely on who decides to act, and who keeps pretending not to hear. By the last telling, the elders lowered their voices, not out of fear, but precision. They said some truths lose power when shouted. What remained was a reminder etched into rhythm rather than words. Balance doesn't announce itself when it returns. It's recognized by the absence of excess. They believe the world itself responds to correction, not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly. Tension eases, conflict slows. Systems that thrived on imbalance begin to falter without knowing why. That's why correction was never framed as resistance, but as withdrawal, starving imbalance of attention, fuel, and denial. There's an irony here most people miss. The ancient warning wasn't pessimistic, it was practical. It assumed collapse was optional. That assumption alone separates ancestral African thought from many later traditions built around inevitability and salvation narratives. One says, wait, the other says, act. What survives today isn't a doctrine, but a posture, an orientation toward the world that values rhythm over speed, relationship over control, memory over myth. It doesn't reject modernity, it questions its direction. And questioning direction, as history shows, is the first step toward change. And so the story settles into silence, not because it's finished, but because the next movement isn't spoken. It's lived. What happens from here won't be decided by ancient voices alone, but by whether the present is finally ready to meet them halfway. The elders said every revelation must close the way it opened, not with certainty, but with reverence. What you've just heard was never meant to dominate belief, only to awaken memory. Africa's legacy isn't trapped in ruins or symbols frozen in time. It breathes quietly in rhythms, in resilience, in the stubborn refusal of a people to be erased from their own story. The past, they taught, is not behind us. It sleeps beneath the present, waiting for moments of imbalance to stir it awake. And many mysteries still rest under sand, stone, and silence. Not lost, just patient. Each generation uncovers only what it's ready to carry. If this story unsettled you, that's not a flaw. It's a sign. Respect often begins with discomfort, and admiration grows from listening without rushing to control what's been heard. The ancestors never demanded agreement, only attention. So if you feel that quiet pull to continue, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and walk with us as more forgotten truths rise from the deep memory of the world.